Chapter 5. Anthony Pulls Up Stakes. When those two great Australians, Norman Brooks and Anthony Wilding, had played their brilliant tennis in America, Trent had been a close follower of their play. He had interviewed them for his paper. In those days he himself was a respectable performer at the game. Brooks had given him one of his own rackets, which was no longer in first-class condition. It was especially made for the Australian by a firm in Melbourne. So pleased was Trent with it that he, later, sent to Australia for two more. It happened that the manager of the sporting goods store in Melbourne was a young American who believed in the efficacy of follow-up letters. It was a large and prosperous firm, and it followed up Anthony Trent with thoroughness. He received square envelopes addressed by hand by every third Australian mail. Mrs. Sawyer's boarders, being of that kind which interests itself in others' affairs and discusses them, were intrigued at these frequent missives from the Antipodes. Finally, Trent invented an Uncle Samuel who had, so he affirmed, left his native land when an adventurous child of 9 and made a great fortune among the Kalgoorlie goldfields. Possessing a nimble wit, he related to his fellow boarders amazing accounts of his uncle's activities. The boarders often discussed this uncle, his strange dislike of women, the beard which fell to his knees, the team of racing kangaroos which drew his buggy, and so forth. At the breakfast table on the morning when Anthony Trent faced his world no longer an honest man, it was observed that he was disinclined to talk. As a matter of fact, he wanted a reasonable excuse for leaving the Sawyer establishment. The woman had been kind and considerate to him, and he had few grievances. The mail brought him an enticing letter from Melbourne, offering him all that the tennis player needs at special prices. "I trust your uncle is well," Mrs. Clark observed. It was in that moment Trent got his inspiration. "I'm afraid he's very ill," he said sadly. "At his age he must be almost 90. "Only 84," Mrs. Clark reminded him. She remembered the year of his emigration. 84 is a great age to attain," he declared, "and he has lived not wisely but well. I feel I should go out and see if there's anything I can do." "You're going to leave us?" gasped Mrs. Sawyer. His going would deprive her of a most satisfactory lodger. "I'm afraid my duty is plain," he returned gravely. Thus he left Mrs. Sawyer's establishment. Years later he wondered whether if he had enjoyed better cooking he would have fallen from grace, and if he could not with justice blame a New England boiled dinner for his lapse. For a few days he stayed at a quiet hotel. He wanted a small apartment on Central Park. There were reasons for this. First, he must live alone in a house where no officious elevator boys observed his going and his coming. Central Park West offered many such houses, and if it should happen that he ever had to flee from the pursuit of those who guarded the mansions that faced him on the park's eastern side, there was no safer way home than across the silent grass. He was one of those New Yorkers who know their Central Park. There had been a season when a friend gave him the use of a saddle horse, and there was no bridle path that he did not know. He was fortunate in finding rooms at the top of a fine old brownstone house in the 80s. There were 4 large rooms all overlooking the park. That he was compelled to climb 5 flights of stairs was no objection in his eyes. A little door to the left of his own entrance gave admission to a ladder leading to the roof. None of the other tenants, so the agent informed him, ever used it. Anthony Trent was relieved to hear it. "I sleep badly," he said, "possibly because I read a great deal and am anxious to try open-air sleeping. If I might have the right to use the roof for that, I should be very willing to pay extra." "Glad to have you there," said the agent heartily. "You'll be a sort of night watchman for the property." He laughed at his jest. "Insomnia's plain hell, ain't it? I used to suffer that way. I walk a great deal now, and that cures me. Do you take drugs?" "I'm afraid of them," Anthony Trent declared. I walk a good deal at night when the streets are quiet." The agent reported to his office that Trent was a studious man who slept badly and wanted to sleep on the roof, also that he took long tramps at night. A good tenant, in fine. Thus he spread about the report which Trent desired. The selection of a housekeeper was of extreme importance. She must be an elderly, quiet body without callers or city relatives. Her references must be examined thoroughly. He interviewed a score of women before he found what he wanted. She was a Mrs. Phoebe Kinney from Agawam, a village overlooking Buzzard's Bay. A widow, childless and friendless, she had occupied similar positions in Massachusetts, but this would be the first one in New York. He observed in his talk with her that she conceived the metropolis to be the world's centre of wickedness. She assured her future employer that she kept herself to herself because she could never be certain that the man or woman who addressed a friendly remark to her might not be a criminal. "Keep that attitude and we two shall agree splendidly," he said. "I have few friends and no callers. I am of a studious disposition and cannot bear interruptions. If you had friends in New York I should not hire you. I sometimes keep irregular hours, but I shall expect to find you there all the time. You can have 2 weeks in the summer if you want them." Next day Mrs. Kinney was inducted to her new home. It was a happy choice, for she cooked well and had the New England passion for cleanliness. Trent noticed with pleasure that she was even suspicious of the tradespeople who sent their wares up the dumb waiter, and she discouraged their gossip, who sold meat and bread to her. The many papers he took were searched for their crimes by Mrs. Kinney. Discovery of such records affirmed her in her belief of the city's depravity. In his examination of her former positions, Trent discovered that she had been housekeeper to the Clent Bulstrodes. He knew they were a fine old Boston family of Back Bay, with a mansion on Beacon Street. When he questioned her about it, she told him it was as housekeeper of their summer home on Buzzard's Bay. Young Graham Bulstrode had been a tennis player of note years before. Many a time Anthony Trent had seen him at Longwood. He had dropped out because he drank too much to keep fit. The two were of an age. Mrs. Kinney related the history of the Bulstrode family at length and concluded by remarking that when she first saw her employer at the agency she was reminded of Mr. Graham. "But he looks terrible now," she added. "They say he drinks brandy before breakfast." The next day the society columns of the Herald informed him that the Clent Bulstrodes had bought a New York residence in East 73rd Street, just off the avenue. This information was of peculiar interest to Trent. Now he was definitely engaged in a precarious profession, he was determined to make a success of it. He had smoked innumerable pipes in tabulating those accidents which brought most criminals to sentence. He believed in the majority of cases they had not the address to get away with plausible excuses. It was an ancient and frayed excuse, that of pretending to be sent to read the water or electric meter. And besides, it was not Trent's intention to take to disguises of this sort. He was now engaged in working out the solution of his second adventure. He was to make an attempt upon the house of William Drummond, banker, who lived in 93rd Street and in the same number as the Clent Bulstrodes, 20 blocks to the south. He learned a great deal about Drummond from Clark, his one-time city editor. Clark remembered most of the interesting things about the big man of his day. He told Trent that Drummond invariably carried a great deal of money on his person. He expatiated on the Drummond history. This William Drummond had begun life on an Iowa farm. He had gradually saved a little money and then lent it at extravagant interest. Later he specialized on mortgages, foreclosing directly he knew his client unable to meet his notes. His type was a familiar one and had founded many fortunes. Clark painted him as a singularly detestable creature. "But why," demanded Anthony Trent, "does a man like that risk his money if he's so keen on conserving it? One would think he wouldn't take out more than his car fare, for fear either of being robbed or borrowed from." "As for robbing," Clark returned, He's a great husky beast, although he's nearly 60. And as to being borrowed from, that's why he takes it out. He belongs to a lot of clubs, not the Knickerbocker type, but the sort of clubs where rich young fellows go to play poker. They know old Drummond can lend 'em the ready cash without any formalities any time they wish it. Ever sit in a poker game, son, and got a hunch that if you were able to buy just one more pile of chips you'd clean up?" "I have," said the other, smiling, "but my hunch has generally been wrong." "Most hunches are," Clark commented. "Theirs are too, but that old scoundrel makes thousands out of just such hunches. He puts it up to the borrower that it's between club members and so forth, not a money-lending transaction. Tells him he doesn't lend money as a rule, and so forth and so on. I know he was asked to resign from one club for it. He's a bloodsucker. If I had an automobile, I'd watch for him to cross the street and then run him down." "Has he ever stung you?" Trent asked. "Me? Not on your life. He specializes in rich men's sons. He wouldn't lend you or me a nickel if we were starving. You remember young Hodgson Grant, who committed suicide last year? They said it was the heat that got him. It was William Drummond." "Why does he keep up a house on such a street as he does? I should think he lives cheaper." "A young second wife. Threw the old one away, so to speak, and got a high stepper that makes him speed up. She thinks she'll get into society. Not a chance, son, not a chance. I know." It was on some of William Drummond's money that Anthony Trent had set his heart. It salved what was still a conscience to know that he was taking back profits unlawfully made, bleeding a bloodsucker. Owing to the second Mrs. Drummond's desire to storm society, she cultivated publicity. There were pictures of herself and her prize-winning red chows in dog papers. In other magazines she was seen driving her two high-stepping hackneys, Lord Ping and Lady Pong, at the Mineola Horse Show. Also, there was an article on her home in a magazine devoted to interior decoration. A careful study of it answered every question concerning its layout that the most careful cracksman needed to know. Trent spent a week in learning how Drummond occupied his time. The banker invariably left his most profitable club at midnight, never earlier. By 12:30 he was in his library, smoking one of the cigars that had been given him that night. Then a drink of gin and water. Afterwards, bed. The house was protected by the Sherlock system of burglar alarm, a tiresome invention to those who were ignorant of it. Anthony Trent regarded it as an enemy and had mastered it successfully, for there were tricks of lock opening not hard to one as mechanically able as he, and many a criminal had talked to him openly when he had covered police headquarters years before. Drummond drank very little. When asked, he invariably took a cigar. He was possessed of great strength and still patronized the club gymnasium. For 2 hours one night Drummond sat near him at a certain famous athletic club. On that night there were certain changes to be observed in the appearance of Anthony Trent. He seemed to have put on 20 pounds in weight and 10 years in age. The art of make-up, which had been forced upon him in college theatricals, had recently engaged his attention. It was an art of which he had thought little until for his paper he had once interviewed Beerbone Tree and had seen the amazing changes skilful make-up may create. Ordinarily he slipped in and out silently, not encouraging Mrs. Kinney to talk. On this particular night he asked her a question concerning a missing letter, and she came out into the lighted hall. "You gave me quite a shock," she said. "You look as like Mr. Graham Bulstrode as one pea is like another, although I've never seen him in full evening dress." She was plainly impressed by her employer's magnificence, although she feared this unusual flush on his ordinarily pale face meant that he'd been having more to drink than was good for him. It was the tribute for which Trent had waited. If Mrs. Kinney had never seen the son of her former master in the garb of fashion, her present employer had, and that within the week, and he had observed him carefully. He had seen that Bulstrode was wearing during the nights of late autumn an Inverness cape of light-weight black cloth lined with white silk. To Trent it seemed rather stagey, but that did not prevent him from ordering its duplicate from Bulstrode's tailor. Bulstrode clung to the opera hat rather than to the silk hat which has almost superseded it. Tonight Trent wore an opera hat. Bulstrode came into the Athletic Club at 11:30. He was slightly under the influence of liquor and his face no redder than that of Trent, who waited across the street in the shadow of the park wall. No sooner had Bulstrode been whirled off in a taxi than Anthony Trent went into the club. To the attendants it seemed that he had returned for something forgotten. With his Inverness still on and his hat folded, he lost himself in the crowded rooms and found at last William Drummond. The banker nodded cordially. It was evident to the impostor that the banker had wished to ingratiate himself with the new member. The Bulstrodes had enormous wealth and a name that was recognized. To his greeting Anthony Trent returned a solemn owl-like stare. "Shylock," he hiccuped insolently. Drummond flushed but said nothing. Indeed, he looked about him to see if the insult had been overheard by any other member. Inwardly Trent chuckled. He had now no fear of being discovered. Bulstrode probably knew few men at the club. He had not been in town as a resident for a month yet. He sank into a chair and read an evening paper, watching in reality the man Drummond. End of chapter 5.